Hey everyone, welcome to my garden. What I'm going to share with you today is a few different ways to process your cover crop. Now, one important thing to think about is this. Farmers that have 100, 200, 500, 1,000 acres will never, ever in 1,000 years, in 100 years, in a million years, go and put compost through or over that entire amount of acreage. And the reason why is because not enough compost exists for them in that particular area. So what they do is they rely on something called green manure. Now, green manure is another name for cover crops. Now, specific mixes of cover crops are formulated, put together, grown, because what they do is they build nutrients, vital, important nutrients in the soil. Now, once we have our cover crop growing, now there's a couple of different ways to process the cover crop. Now, one of the quickest and easiest ways is to get yourself a pair of shears and go along, and all you do is just trim off your cover crop. Okay, now when you trim it off, there's probably I'm gonna say probably a good 80% chance it's not gonna grow back. But on the offside that it does, there's a second way to process it. Now, let me say this in addition to this process. So from here, when I go along and I start processing my cover crop, okay, and I'm trimming it all off, now you can just leave all this on because that's gonna dry out and that's gonna decompose, okay? Now, another thing you can do is you can go along, and after you've trimmed it off, you can take your fork. I prefer to use a fork because a fork does a lot less damage to the earthworms and various other things in the soil. And so I'll go along with a fork, and from here, what you'll do is turn it over. Now, you'll notice when you go to turn it over that your soil kind of clumps together, and that's because of the root structure underneath. Now, when you turn it over, nothing fancy, just turn it over, okay? Now, getting back to the first way of processing our cover crop, and that's this. When we cut our cover crop off, now imagine if I went in here, and some farmers might go in with a cultivator, or some people in a situation like me might even use their lawnmower. They go through, they cut it all off, and now you have this cover crop on the ground, and in the next couple of weeks, this is gonna dry off, it's all gonna die. Now, all the organic matter is now fixed inside the soil. So now the question is, how do you spread your compost? How do you work your compost in? Well, one way to work your compost in is either top dress your compost after you've turned it in, okay? And then you kind of work it in just for the first inch or two. You don't want to work your compost too much in, okay? Now, another way to process it after you've cut it off like this, okay, is simply, all right, because your green manure is not what's above the ground, it's what's below the ground. All those roots are holding the nutrients below the soil. So another way to plant, let's imagine this is all decomposed. Well, all you do is you simply go along, you make a hole, okay, like so. Nothing fancy, okay? Let me go on more of an angle like this, okay? So you make a hole, you take your plant, you drop your plant in the hole, boom, okay? Imagine this is my plant. I drop my plant in, I take some compost, put some compost in if you want, and cover it up, and that's it. It's the most efficient way to, intrusion. It's the most efficient way to have the smallest amount of intrusion into your garden. Now, in the world of permaculture, this is how a permaculture person who's doing gardening will actually grow. They won't turn all their soil over, then put compost, then turn the compost in, because it's just so many processes. They're disturbing all of the microorganisms, the microbes, the nematodes, the worms, everything that's underneath the soil. So they want to have the minimalist amount of intrusion. So that's one way to approach it. The other way is, if you are going to turn your cover crop over, the best thing to do is turn it over, and then when you do plant, okay, as I was saying, instead of broadcasting compost through the whole thing, bringing in yards and yards, now because we've got so many nutrients being fixed in the soil from the cover crop, we don't need to bring in yards and yards of compost anymore. You can bring in a smaller amount, put a small amount of compost in and plant. Or if you're using an organic fertilizer, and we have a couple of spectacular organic fertilizers, you simply put your organic fertilizer in with your plants, cover it up, and let it grow. So there's a few different ways to process your cover crops and how to grow in your garden beds using a cover crop with or without compost and with or without even an organic fertilizer. Now, in this case, because we have such spectacular soil and a really great cover crop growing here, you could simply put your plants in here and you don't necessarily even need to put a cover crop in here. Or I should say an organic fertilizer or a compost, I should say. So you could simply just turn this over, let it decompose for a month, plant straight into it, go from there. Now, on the flip side, if I was gonna put in lettuce, let's say I cut this over or I cut this off and I wanna put in greens. Now, greens don't require a volume of nutrients. They're not a heavy feeder like tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, things like that. So I would just simply cut it off, make a little hole, boom, take my little lettuce start, drop it in, cover it up, let it grow, just like that. Now, some of this may come back a second time, and in an urban setting where your garden patch might be 5 by 5, 4 by 8 size, smaller size, you can simply go along with a pair of scissors and trim it off. Eventually, they won't come back, and that's it. And that's the best way to do it. So those are some ideas. That's some food for thought, and have fun, and we'll see you in the next video.
Question, James, before we jump off here,
yeah,
is when should gardeners cut their cover crop?
What is the best time to cut your cover crop? Great question. So you want to cut your cover crop 30 days before you're going to be planting. So on average, let's say we try to plant by about the middle of May in here in the Pacific Northwest in Metro Vancouver. So I would say think about cutting it sometime late March, early May, or I should say late March, early April. All right, so that as of say May 1st, you could plant in it. But again, if I went and cut all of this off today and I was going to put in a whole bunch of greens, then I definitely am going to just go ahead and plant straight into it today.
Without cutting or with cutting?
I would cut it off. After I cut it,
okay,
I'll just make a hole and plant straight into it. Now here's one. I'm going to add one caveat, one important caveat. If you are someone who is going to be planting your plants from seeds, that changes things a little bit, because what you're going to end up doing is you're going to cut it off. If you're going to be putting in seeds, you're going to definitely want to turn your cover crop over. Now, there's two schools of thought. One is cut it all off. Some people will tell you, take all this green stuff, throw it into your big compost bin. Other schools of thought, turn it over, let it all decompose. So there's no perfect way to do it. There's no exact science to it, okay? But if you are going to be growing your plants from seeds, then you'll definitely want to be turning your cover crop over so that you've got perfectly lovely, chocolate cake type soil exposed, so you can plant your seeds into that soil. So that's the main reason why you would turn it over, so that you can plant your seeds directly in. And also make sure, this is a critical point. Most people, when they work their compost into their soil, they try to work it in at a good depth of 12 inches, the length of these tines. Now, if you're gonna work your compost in that much, what's gonna happen is you're basically taking all the nutrients from that compost that are sitting right up here on the surface, and rather than working them in maybe 2 inches, you're gonna work them all the way down here. The reality is most of our vegetable roots won't often get that deep. And when those nutrients from the compost start to actually get worked in deeper and deeper and deeper, or I should say watered in deeper and deeper, all right, as we work them in, we water them in, they're gonna be lost. So they're not gonna be bioavailable to our plants. So really important, don't work your compost in a lot. Just work it in a couple inches. That's it. And there we have it.
And then I have another question. If there are gardeners that want to put some the cool weather crops plant starts in now?
Yes.
Like any time between now and the 20th of April?
Yes.
Or now and the end of April? How do you suggest they deal with their cover crop?
The best thing to do is cut it off
Right now?
right now. Absolutely.
Good.
You're going to cut it off right now, and if you anticipate putting seeds in, turn it over, plant right away.
Your cool weather seeds.
Because a lot of the
Yep.
cool weather crops that you can put in right now are, you can put in your leeks, your beets, your onions, things like that, your radishes, your lettuce, your mesclans, your kale, your Swiss chards, things like that,
broccoli,
your broccoli, right, your cauliflowers, things like that. So you can put those cold weather crops in right now and get them going.
Yeah.
And so by all means, just take your soil. If you're going to put seeds in, turn it over, plant your seeds. Now, at the same time, if you're somebody that says, you know what, I can't get really low, I don't have a nice pair of shears, I don't want to sit there with a pair of scissors and, trim it off, and, using these shears is, kind of tedious, and you'd rather just, cut it, turn it over, then you can do that as well. And alternatively, all right, and now this isn't, always, there's no exact perfect way, but you don't always have to cut it either. The reason why we cut it sometimes is because our cover crops, all right, in a farmer setting, a cover crop might be anywhere between 12, 18 inches, 24 inches tall. So they need to cut it in order to cultivate it. But in an urban setting where our cover crop is maybe 6, 8, 10 inches tall, you can simply just take it like this, all right, and just turn it upside down. But here's the downside. You can see where the grass will poke out like this. Now, if you want to avoid that, that's why when you do cut it, okay, in a setting like this, okay, when you cut it like that, the simplest thing to do when you do turn it over is you turn it over and it's right there. And then what it does is it buries all those little pieces of grass.
And when you say grass, you're really talking barley.
Or I should say, yeah.
Because there's no grass.
When I say our grass, it's
the barley.
It's the vetch.
Winter
it's
rye.
the barley.
Yeah.
It's the peas.
Yeah.
We're cutting it and covering it up just like that.
Awesome.
So,
Sounds great.
awesome. Thanks you for watching, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Cheers.